Okay, lesson 9, building the future. Women, education, and young people in Nazi Germany. Let's move straight into the key questions for this lesson. Question number 1, why did the Nazis attach so much importance to women and the young? How much impact did Nazi policies to women have? How much did the Nazis change Germany's education system? And finally, how much impact did Nazi youth policy have? So I hope you can get sufficient notes on those and come armed with some questions. So let's begin with women in Nazi Germany. Well, during the Weimar era, during the Weimar era from 1919 up to 1932-33, the position of women actually had improved in Germany, as it had in many countries throughout the world. There were years of progress. Women had acquired the right to vote. Many more women were in paid employment. It appeared to be a real progression for women, their rights within society, and the opportunities available to them as well. Sort of a typical sort of image of a woman of the 1920s in the Weimar era, looking very stylish, smoking a cigarette, of which the Nazis heartily disapproved. Women in Nazi Germany then. So what sort of changes are happening once the Nazis take power? What's their idea about the role of women? Well, they saw the sort of new woman of the 1920s, the fashionable new woman with the new style of clothes, independent, walking around outside unchaperoned, shopping or whatever, working, being more independent. They saw that as selfish and immoral. They were very traditional, very old-fashioned in their outlook to the role of women. They saw the role of women within society as being a domestic role, that of childbearing and raising children. So basically being a homemaker, looking after the home, raising children. It's a famous sort of three-syllable acronym, KKK, Kinder, Kirche, Kusch, child, church, and kitchen. A very limiting role. And the other thing was pro-natalism. What do we mean by pro-natalism? Well, they wanted manpower for Germany's armed forces, industry, and to settle new territories conquered via Lebensraum, to become the sort of German landowning class, perhaps with Slavic serfs. And in order to encourage more births, they had a number of strategies. One was a marriage loan scheme. So young couples were given a large loan, quite a substantial loan, which they could repay at very favourable rates of interest. So quite an incentive to get married. The idea being that people get married and have lots of children, make lots of young Germans who would either join the army or become girls who and mothers of the future, to make yet more young Nazis of the future. There was also propaganda outlining the role of women and praising the idea of having children. This here is a medal. Women could actually receive a medal for childbearing. You'd get a gold one if you had 8 children, silver for 6 children, and you get a bronze medal for 4 children. They had, oh, by the way, another one thing, in 1933, back in the 1920s, think about 1927, there was an abortion law, and allowed women to have abortions under certain circumstances. That was scrapped in 1933, again because of the Nazi emphasis on creating new children for the hoped 1,000-year Reich that Hitler anticipated for the future. This rather severe-looking lady, with her severe hairdo, rather traditional, stern look, is Gertrude Scholz-Klink, and she was the head of the German Women's Organization within Nazi Germany, and they offered courses on basically things like homemaking, home budgeting, looking after children, raising children, motherhood, and so on. So very much emphasizing these roles for women. Well, how much impact did these policies towards women actually have? Well, have a look at this cute little fellow over here. Limited success, basically, in terms of raising the birth rate, which is one of the main things that they wanted. A very small increase in the birth rate, and probably not likely due, particularly, to the Nazi policies. It was probably largely due to the improving economy, so people felt confident to have children. It remained below the birth rates of 1914 anyhow. The marriage loan scheme didn't actually result in couples actually having any more children, so many of them took advantage of the marriage loan scheme, but they didn't then go on to have large families. A lot of women remained in work. In fact, the numbers gradually increased throughout the 1930s. So, there was a lot of employment required in the armament industry, and especially as war took place and men were drafted off, conscripted into the army, women had to take over a lot of roles, train drivers, wardens, factory workers, and so on. Let's move on to education within Nazi Germany and have a look at that. So, what were the Nazi educational priorities? Well, basically, they wanted committed Nazis. They wanted to create the Nazis of the future, committed to the ideological goals, beliefs, orientations of the Nazi Party. They wanted the boys to be ready and fit for military service, and they wanted the girls to be wives and mothers. Something they didn't want, which is something we do encourage in our lessons at school, is they didn't want critical thinking. That was not a priority. You want people to swallow the Nazi message whole without analysing it, debating it, looking for evidence, the sort of things that we associate with a good education. So what did they learn in their history lessons? They learned about the great German heroes of the past, the mythic German of the heroes of the past. They learned the erroneous and fictitious historical lie, I guess, really, that socialists and Jews had been responsible for the loss of Germany in the First World War and were undermining the fabric of German society. And they learned, in inverted commas, that Hitler was the saviour of Germany and he had led them out of this ignoble defeat. Let's have a look at some examples of how traditional school subjects were perverted according to the Nazi ideology. Well, within biology, they were taught so-called racial science. And again, as we sort of talked about previously, the whole idea is basically entirely unscientific. In terms of biology, there are no such things as races. If you were to analyse my DNA or your DNA, you'd find a bunch of ancestors stretching back towards Africa when our common ancestors migrated from Africa about 70,000 years ago. So extraordinarily unscientific. These are the sorts of things they learned. They learned about the superiority, supposedly, of the Aryans, the inferiority of the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, and something called racial hygiene. Again, these notions of hygiene have arisen because of discoveries, some of them actually within Germany, of things like bacteria and so on. And that sort of idea of bacteria and viruses is misapplied to races. It's all racial hygiene, to discourage the mingling of the races. So they don't want to, in their idea, dilute Aryan blood with Slavic blood or Jewish blood or blood of other races throughout the globe. It encouraged students, boys especially, to be ruthless. These were intended to be the ruthless leaders of the future, to be pitiless, not to engage in the sort of things that you'd encourage, really, in a good rounded education, in terms of empathy, sympathy, pity for others. These were not encouraged because it was felt that the Germans of the future would have to engage in a ruthless struggle for Germany and racial domination and be prepared to expunge or exterminate inferior, in their eyes, races. Educational standards, as a consequence, were pretty low. You've got no encouragement of critical thinking. Biology, other sciences, mathematics have been perverted to try and reinforce Nazi ideology. Here's a particularly hideous example again. This is actually an example of propaganda, but this is a typical mathematical problem that a child might receive in their mathematics syllabus. Here you have excuse me, stuttering. Here you have a sort of noble, able-bodied Aryan, and you have an alcoholic idler over here, and perhaps somebody with mental difficulties over here, mentally handicapped person, and they're portrayed as burdens on the hard-working Aryan. And this is to encourage the idea that these sorts of people ought to be taken out of society, removed from society. And in fact, that's what the Nazis attempted later on. Fortunately, to some extent, unsuccessfully within Germany, in terms of popular support anyway. Let's move on. For both boys and girls, there was a big emphasis on PE. Hitler was quite obsessed with physical education, physical fitness, and he wanted these fit young soldiers and fit young mothers for the future. You see a typical example here of boys engaging in physical combat, boxing. Again, the idea being to toughen them up through combat, through experiencing being struck. It's going to toughen them up. 2 hours a day of PE. Girls would be doing these sorts of things, calisthenics, outdoor exercises, things encouraging them to be healthy young mothers for the future. They were so-called elite schools. So these were schools that were intended to educate the future elite of Nazi Germany, the higher-up civil servants and officials within the Nazi party. So these schools were Napolas. At a more elite level than the Napolas were the Adolf Hitler schools. And the idea was that these were the schools for the elite who would then go on to become senior members of the Nazi party and rule Germany and rule over conquered territories. And these would graduate to a sort of university of Nazism, the so-called Order Castles. Let's move on. Youth movements. Well, if you remember from last lesson, the KDF is the umbrella organisation. There were no movements or recreational activities or clubs allowed in the evening unless they were affiliated with the KDF, the Strength Through Joy movement. So things like, even if you wanted to open a chess club, it would have to be under the umbrella of the Nazi organisation. And the same things happens with youth organisations. They're afraid of, at home, children may be hearing, maybe they live in a household where the parents are communists in their sympathy, social democrats or Catholics, and who may be criticising Nazi ideology. So they want to remove children from that environment, evenings and weekends, and subject them to a constant barrage of Nazi propaganda. And as a consequence, in 1930, it becomes the only legal youth organisation. A lot of opposition to that from Catholic organisations and other organisations that had youth groups previously, but it becomes the only legal youth organisation. In 1936, it's got 4 million members, so I guess that's some measure of success, but it had, however, by that stage, become compulsory. Let's look at boys and girls. You had the Pimpfen, for young boys from the age of 6 to 10. Oh, sorry, let's have a look at this guy. Balder von Schirach was the head of the Hitler Youth. You'll do some research on him. So you had the little fellows. These are like the cadets between the ages of 6 and 10. Then between the ages of 10 and 14, boys were in the Deutsche Jungvolk, the German young people, and they joined the Hitler Youth between the ages of 14 and 18. After that age, they would either be conscripted into the German army or join the Reich Labour Service and perform labour on the autobahns or hospital building or whatever. The girls, at the age of 10, you can see again a slight lessening of priorities in the Nazi mindset towards girls. They would join the League of German Young Girls, Jung Madel-Bund, at 10 to 14, and the BDM, the Bund Deutsche Madel, the Bund Deutsche Madel, or League of German Girls, between the ages of 14 and 18. And again, an emphasis on homemaking, sewing, motherhood, and so on. What sort of activities did they do? Well, boys engaged in a lot of things like camping. That was quite popular. Physical activities, camping, and so on. Hiking in the German out in the German countryside. Other things like military drill, weapons training, how to disassemble, clean, and fire a weapon. Again, you can see the emphasis on military for the boys there. For girls, again, the emphasis was on homemaking, child rearing, and so on. So did the Nazi youth policies achieve their objectives? Well, in some ways, yes. Certainly in the early years, the youth movements were quite popular. It was the camps where you had an opportunity for children to get out of the cities, into the countryside, to meet other young people. That was going to be popular, to mix and mingle with other young people. So that was quite popular. And I say some of the things like the camping and the hiking were quite popular. However, by the end of the 1930s, the popularity of the Hitler Youth had waned. It was decreasing. Things become less desirable, I guess, when you're forced to do them. And there was more of an emphasis on the unpopular aspects as well. Things like political lectures. Doesn't sound thrilling, does it? A political lecture. Military drill. Again, perhaps not the best idea of fun ever. And the minority of German youth did rebel against this. The minority were rebellious. Let's have a look at a couple of examples here. So the first of these groups we'll have a look at are the swing kids, the so-called swing kids. These are mainly middle-class German youth, and they enjoy listening to American jazz music. Now, this is frowned upon by the Reich Ministry of Culture, who denounce American jazz music with the usual perverse, racist criticisms of it and its origins. And between 1941 and 1942, quite a number of kids are arrested. There's some degree of crackdown on the swing kids. Moving on to the Edelweiss Pirates. These are much more active and violent in their opposition to the regime. These groups sprang up in the late 1930s. They were named after the areas the various gangs were in. So there was the Cologne pirates, the Mutten pirates, and so on. And these were, as I say, gangs of youths. They did sort of similar things in some ways. They liked hiking and going on camping trips. But one of their slogans was eternal war on the Hitler Youth, and the sort of drilling and conformity that it represented. In fact, they used to ambush and beat up members of the Hitler Youth when they could. A number, I think several hundred of the Edelweiss pirates were sent to concentration camps, and a couple, I believe, were even executed for killing an SS officer. Now then, to some extent, the policies of the Hitler Youth and Nazi education did succeed in making particularly males tough and hard, but not in a way that is admirable at all. The brutalization, the encouragement of ruthlessness and pitilessness, perhaps was expressed as that generation that grew up out of the Hitler Youth went on to fight on the Eastern Front and participated in some of the war crimes and massacres there. So that's obviously a horrifying result of that sort of brutalization of youth and encouragement of aggression. Well, I hope you made some good notes there, and I guess I'll see you in the lesson.